The wind howled through the gaps in the timber walls like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of death. Luke Harrigan pressed another damp cloth to Thomas Hale's burning forehead, though he knew it was little more than a gesture now. The fever had taken hold 3 days ago, and in this godforsaken hunting camp 40 miles from the nearest town, there wasn't much to be done except wait. "Luke," Thomas's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, rough as sandpaper against wood. "I'm here." Luke leaned closer, trying not to wince at the rattle in his friend's chest. They'd known each other since they were boys of 12, running wild through the Missouri hills, dreaming of adventure and fortune in the Western Territories. Now, 15 years later, those dreams had led them to this crude shelter in the Montana wilderness, surrounded by pelts that would make them rich if Thomas lived to see spring. "I need to ask you something." Thomas's eyes, once bright blue as a summer sky, now looked glazed and distant. "A promise." Luke's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before, men on their deathbeds suddenly remembering debts unpaid, messages undelivered, sins unconfessed. "Whatever you need." Thomas fumbled beneath the pile of buffalo robes, his movements weak and uncoordinated. After a moment, he produced a small square of white cloth, edges yellowed with age and handling. Even in the dim light of the oil lamp, Luke could make out the letter M embroidered in the corner with blue thread. "Find her," Thomas said, pressing the handkerchief into Luke's palm. "Margaret O'Connell. Goes by Maggie. She's in Dry Creek, works at the boarding house there." Luke stared at the delicate piece of fabric, so out of place in his calloused hands. "Thomas, I don't understand." "Marry her." The words came out in a rush, as if Thomas feared he might not have time to finish. "I promised I'd come back for her, promised I'd make an honest woman of her. But I'm not. I won't." A coughing fit seized him, spots of blood appearing on his lips. Luke helped him drink a few sips of melted snow water. His mind racing, in all their years together. Thomas had never mentioned a woman. They'd shared everything. Food when times were lean, warmth when the cold threatened to take them, stories of home when the loneliness got too heavy. How had he kept this secret? "She got nobody," Thomas continued when he could speak again. "Her pa died in a mine collapse. Ma took sick the following winter. She's alone, Luke, and she's braver than both of us put together, though you wouldn't know it to look at her." "Thomas, I can't just marry some woman I never met. That's not—" "You owe me." The words cut through the air sharp as a skinning knife. Thomas's hand found Luke's wrist, gripping with surprising strength. "That time on the Yellowstone, when the Blackfeet had me pinned down, you came back for me when any sensible man would have run." Luke remembered. 3 arrows in Thomas's side, blood turning the riverbank mud red. Luke had ridden straight into their camp, guns blazing, pulled Thomas onto his horse and rode like the devil himself was chasing them. Which, in a way, he had been. "That was different," Luke said quietly. "That was saving your life. And now I'm asking you to save hers." Thomas's grip loosened, his brief surge of energy fading. Not from arrows or bullets, from something worse. From being alone in a world that chews up women like her and spits them out. Luke wanted to argue. He wasn't the marrying kind, never had been. The freedom of the territories, the wildness of the life they'd chosen, it didn't leave room for the complications of a wife. But looking down at his friend's face, seeing the desperate pleading in those fading eyes, he found the protest dying in his throat. "Tell me about her," he said instead. A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's cracked lips. "Met her 2 winters back when I was laid up in Dry Creek with a broken leg. She was the one tended to me at the boarding house, proper as a schoolmarm on Sunday. But underneath, he paused, gathering strength. Underneath, she's got steel in her spine. Seen her face down drunk cowboys twice her size. Seen her work 18 hours straight without complaint when the sickness came through town. If she's so strong, why does she need protecting? Because strong don't mean safe. Because a woman alone out here, no matter how tough. Thomas trailed off. But Luke understood. He'd seen what happened to women without protection in the territories. The lucky ones ended up in brothels. The unlucky ones ended up worse. Does she know about this promise of yours? Thomas's eyes shifted away. Told her I'd come back after this season. Told her we'd be married come spring. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. She believed me. Don't know why a woman like that would believe a fool like me, but she did. The wind picked up outside, sending snow through the cracks to dust the dirt floor white. Luke pulled the buffalo robes higher on his friend's chest, though he could feel the cold had already settled too deep. What aren't you telling me? Luke asked. There's something else. Thomas was quiet so long Luke thought he might have drifted off. Then, she's scarred, bad burn down one side of her face from when she was young. Makes some folk cruel, the way they look at her. But Luke, I swear to God, when she smiles, when she really smiles, it's like watching the sun come up over the mountains. Luke turned the handkerchief over in his hands. Such a small thing to carry such weight. And if she doesn't want to marry me, if she takes one look at me and says no, then you tried. Then my soul can rest knowing you tried. Thomas's breathing had grown shallower, each inhale a monumental effort. But she will. She's practical that way. Knows what's necessary to survive. That's no basis for a marriage. It's a better basis than most out here. Thomas managed to fix him with one last clear look. Promise me, Luke. On that life debt you say you don't owe. Promise me you'll find her. Offer her your name and your protection. Let her decide the rest. Luke felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him heavier than any blizzard. He'd made promises before, to partners, to employers, to himself. But this felt different. This felt like catching a falling star and being asked to carry it the rest of his days. I promise, he said finally, the words tasting strange in his mouth. I'll find your Maggie O'Connell. I'll offer her marriage. And you'll be good to her. It wasn't a question. I'll be good to her. Thomas's hand found his one more time, weak but warm. Better man than me, Luke Harrigan always were. They sat in silence after that, listening to the storm rage outside. Luke kept the cloth to Thomas's forehead, kept talking about nothing important, the price of pelts, the best route through the passes come spring, memories of Missouri summers, somewhere near dawn, between one breath and the next. Thomas Hale slipped away, quiet as snow falling. Luke closed his friend's eyes, pulled the robes over his face. He'd bury him when the storm passed, deep enough the wolves wouldn't find him. But first, he had preparations to make, a horse to ready, supplies to pack, a journey to plan. He stepped outside into the breaking dawn, the wind cutting through his coat like accusation. The handkerchief was still in his hand, the embroidered M barely visible in the gray light. 40 miles to Dry Creek, 40 miles to a woman he'd never met, a promise he never wanted to make, a life he'd never planned to live. Luke tucked the handkerchief inside his coat, close to his heart where Thomas had probably carried it. The storm was passing, leaving the world white and clean and terribly empty. Somewhere out there, a scarred woman was waiting for a man who would never come home. Well, Thomas, he said to the wind, I hope you knew what you were asking. He turned back inside to begin the grim work of mourning, the promise already settling into his bones like winter cold. Some debts, he was learning, you paid with more than blood. Some debts you paid with the entire course of your life. 2 weeks later, Luke Harrigan rode into Dry Creek with trail dust in his throat and dread in his belly. The town sprawled along a muddy main street, buildings leaning against each other like drunks after a long night. It was bigger than he'd expected, maybe 300 souls scratching out lives between the saloons and the stockyards. He'd barely tied his horse to the post outside Morrison's General Store when the whispers started. Small towns had a way of knowing things before you told them, and by the time he'd brushed the worst of the dust from his coat, half the population seemed to have found urgent business on Main Street. "That's him," he heard a woman hiss to her companion. "The trapper come to claim Tom Hale's woman." Luke kept his eyes forward, jaw set. He'd stopped at Fort Benton on the way, sent word ahead through the telegraph office. It seemed his message had arrived and grown wings. The boarding house sat at the far end of town, a 2-story affair that had seen better days. Paint peeled from its sides like sunburned skin, and the front steps groaned under his weight. Through the window, he could see the dining room, long tables set with mismatched plates. A few early diners hunched over their meals. He'd barely raised his hand to knock when the door swung open. A heavy-set woman with iron-gray hair and suspicious eyes stood before him, arms crossed over her ample chest. "You'd be Luke Harrigan," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. I'm looking for—" "I know who you're looking for." She stepped aside, jerking her head toward the interior. "She's been expecting you, though Lord knows why any decent woman would agree to such an arrangement." Luke bit back his reply. He'd been asking himself the same question for 2 weeks. The landlady, Mrs. Pritchard. She introduced herself with obvious reluctance, led him through the dining room. Every eye followed their progress. Forks suspended halfway to mouths. Conversations dying mid-sentence. Luke felt like a prize bull being led to auction. "She's out back," Mrs. Pritchard said, stopping at a door that led to the rear of the building. "Hanging laundry, though why she insists on doing servant's work when she could be resting like a proper lady before her." She paused, lips pursing like she'd tasted something sour. Before her wedding, Luke stepped through the door into the harsh afternoon light. The yard was small, hemmed in by buildings on all sides, lines of washing strung between posts like ship's rigging. He saw her before she saw him, a tall figure reaching up to pin a sheet. Movements efficient and practiced. Then she turned, and Luke understood why Thomas had used only moonlight words to describe her. The scar ran from her left temple down to her jaw, a twisted river of puckered flesh that pulled at the corner of her eye and mouth. It was the kind of mark that made people look away, then look back when they thought you wouldn't notice. But Luke found himself looking past it almost immediately, drawn instead to eyes the color of storm clouds and a spine that could have been forged from railroad steel. She didn't flinch under his gaze, didn't drop her eyes or turn her scarred side away. Instead, she set down her laundry basket with deliberate calm and walked toward him, each step measured and sure. "Mr. Harrigan." Her voice was lower than he'd expected, roughened by prairie wind or old smoke. "I'm Margaret O'Connell." They stood there, measuring each other like fighters before a bout. She was younger than he'd imagined, maybe 25 to his 30, but her eyes held the weight of more years. Work-roughened hands, clothes mended but clean, boots that had walked many miles. The yard had filled behind him. Luke could feel the crowd pressing through the doorway, hear the whispers building like steam in a kettle. This was better than any traveling show, he supposed, The scarred spinster and the man bound by a dead friend's promise. Margaret, Maggie seemed to make a decision. She raised her voice, pitching it to carry to their audience. Mr. Harrigan, before we proceed, I need to know something. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her gray eyes. Is this promise of yours born of charity? Because if you've come here to save the poor, scarred woman out of pity, I'll ask you to turn around right now and ride back to wherever you came from. The crowd held its breath. Luke felt the test in her words, sharp as a skinning blade. One wrong answer and whatever chance Thomas had wanted for them would die right here in this muddy yard. No, ma'am, he said, matching her volume. I made a promise to a dying friend. That promise was about honor, not charity. What happens next is up to you. She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, the corner of her mouth, the unscarred side, quirked up in what might have been approval. Then we should talk, she said to him privately. The disappointment from the crowd was palpable as she led him back through the boarding house. But instead of heading upstairs to what he assumed were her quarters, she guided him out the front door and down the street to Paulson's Dry Goods. Mr. Paulson lets me use his office sometimes, she explained, producing a key from her pocket. When I need to discuss business. The office was small and cramped, ledgers stacked on every surface, the air thick with the smell of ink and old paper. She gestured him to a chair, then took her own seat behind the desk. The positioning wasn't lost on him. She'd placed herself in the position of authority. Tell me about Thomas, she said without preamble. How did he die? Luke told her. The fever, the storm, the burial he'd managed once the weather cleared. He pulled the handkerchief from his pocket, placed it on the desk between them. She picked it up with careful fingers, traced the embroidered letter once before folding it precisely and tucking it into her own pocket. He was a good man, she said quietly. Foolish in the way dreamers are foolish, but good. He said you were brave. He said a lot of things. She leaned back in the chair, studying him with those storm cloud eyes. Mr. Harrigan, Luke, let me be plain. I'm 26 years old. I've been on my own since I was 19. I earn my keep through honest work, and I've never taken charity from anyone. The fact that you're here, that Thomas sent you, it tells me he thought I needed saving. He was wrong. Then why did you agree to wait? Why send word you'd meet with me? She was quiet for a moment, looking out the small window at the street beyond. Because I'm also practical. A woman alone in a town like this, earning wages at a boarding house, there's no future in it. I'll work until my back gives out or my hands get too twisted, and then what? Thomas offered me something different, a partnership. Is that what you want, a partnership? What I want is irrelevant. What I need is security. What I can offer is a strong back, a good head for figures, and experience running a household. She turned back to him, all business now. I can cook, clean, mend, tend animals, and I know enough about doctoring to keep a man alive through most things. I don't drink, don't gossip, and I mind my own business. What can you offer? Luke found himself oddly charmed by her directness. I've got a claim staked up near the Judith Basin. Good water, sheltered valley. I run a small herd, do some trapping in winter. The cabin's rough but solid. It's honest work, hard but steady. Family? None living, you? The same. She paused. I should tell you about the scar. You don't owe me explanations. I owe you the truth if we're to make an honest agreement. She touched her face briefly, an unconscious gesture. I was 10. There was a fire at the workshop where my mother took in piecing work. I went back for her sewing box. It had my grandmother's silver thimble, the only thing we had worth anything. Burning timber fell. The doctor said I was lucky to keep the eye. It doesn't sound lucky. Be lucky as relative out here, Mr. Harrigan. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Luke could hear the normal sounds of town life, horses hammering from the blacksmith, someone shouting about prices. Inside this small office, it felt like they were negotiating the terms of a treaty. I have conditions, Maggie said finally. I expected you might. First, I keep my own money. Whatever I earn is mine to do with as I please. Luke nodded. Fair enough. Second, I want a proper wedding. Not fancy, but legal and binding in the church with witnesses. Agreed. Third. She hesitated for the first time. This would be a marriage of convenience. I'm not expecting. That is, I understand the practical nature of our arrangement. But I'll need your word that you'll respect my person. That you won't demand anything I'm not willing to give. Luke felt heat climb his neck. You have my word. I'm not that kind of man. Thomas said you were honorable. I hope he was right. She stood, smoothing her skirts. I'll need 2 days to settle my affairs here. We can be married on Saturday if that suits you. That's soon. Is there a reason to wait? You've made your offer. I've accepted. The longer we delay, the more the town will talk. She moved toward the door, then paused. Unless you're having second thoughts? Luke stood as well, struck again by her height. She barely had to look up to meet his eyes. No second thoughts. Saturday it is. She extended her hand like a man would, to shake on a business deal. Her grip was firm, calloused from lye and hot water. Then we have an agreement. Mr. Harrigan. Luke, he said, if we're to be married, you should call me Luke. Luke. She tested the name, then nodded. I'll see you at the church, Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. She left him standing in the office, surrounded by the smell of ink and possibility. Through the window, he watched her walk back toward the boarding house, head high despite the stares and whispers that followed her progress. 2 days? In 2 days, he'd bind himself to a woman he'd known for all of 30 minutes. A woman with steel in her spine and storms in her eyes, who negotiated marriage like a business contract and shook hands like a man. Thomas, you bastard, he thought. Not for the first time, what have you gotten me into? But as he watched Maggie O'Connell face down the judgment of the entire town with nothing but pride and determination, Luke found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, his old friend had known exactly what he was doing. Saturday morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of day that made the mountains stand out sharp against the sky like God's own fence posts. Luke stood in front of the small mirror in his room at the Frontier Hotel, trying to make his collar lie flat. His one good shirt felt stiff with starch, courtesy of Mrs. Pritchard, who'd taken pity on him despite her obvious disapproval of the whole arrangement. The church sat at the north end of town, its whitewashed walls and simple steeple a testament to the community's aspirations toward civilization. Luke arrived early, finding only Reverend Michaels preparing the altar. The older man looked up from his Bible, his weathered face kind but cautious. Mr. Harrigan, I trust you've given this matter appropriate consideration? I have, Reverend. A marriage is a sacred bond, not to be entered into lightly, and even when the circumstances are unusual. Luke wondered how much the Reverend knew about those circumstances. Probably everything. Secrets in Dry Creek had the lifespan of morning frost. I understand, sir. I intend to honor my vows. The Reverend studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Miss O'Connell is a fine woman. She deserves a man who sees that. Before Luke could respond, the church door opened. He turned, expecting Maggie, but instead found Samuel Paulson, the dry goods store owner, followed by his wife, Emma. They took seats in the front pew, Samuel giving Luke a firm nod. Over the next few minutes, more townspeople filtered in. Not many, maybe a dozen souls, but more than Luke had expected. He recognized Mrs. Chen from the laundry, old Henrik the blacksmith, a few others whose faces he'd seen on Main Street. They came quietly, taking seats with purposeful dignity, as if their presence was a statement. Then the door opened again, and Maggie entered. She wore a simple gray dress, well made but unadorned. No veil, no flowers, just a small cameo at her throat that looked like it had seen generations of wear. Her hair was pulled back in a practical style that made no attempt to hide her scar. She walked alone, no father to give her away, no bridesmaids fluttering around her. Just Margaret O'Connell, approaching her wedding the same way she seemed to approach everything else, with straightforward determination. But when she reached him at the altar, Luke saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, exactly, but a recognition of the moment's weight. They were about to bind their lives together based on nothing more than a dying man's wish and mutual necessity. "Miss O'Connell," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Mr. Harrigan." She took it, her hand steady. Reverend Michaels began the service, his voice filling the small space with comfortable authority. The familiar words washed over Luke: love, honor, cherish, obey. He'd heard them at other men's weddings, always from the safe distance of a back pew. Now they were directed at him, each phrase a link in the chain he was forging. When it came time for the ring, Luke produced the simple gold band he'd bought from Morrison's store. It had cost more than he'd wanted to spend, but something about sliding a cheap ring onto her finger had felt wrong. Maggie looked surprised when she saw it, her eyes meeting his with a question he couldn't answer. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, sliding it onto her work-roughened finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her. She had no ring for him. They hadn't discussed it, but she held his hand for a moment after, her thumb brushing across his knuckles in what might have been gratitude. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Michaels said, then with a small smile. "You may kiss your bride." Luke had been dreading this moment. How did you kiss a woman you'd met twice? But Maggie solved the problem with characteristic practicality, turning her unscarred cheek toward him. He pressed his lips there briefly, catching the scent of soap and something else, lavender maybe, carefully hoarded. And just like that, it was done. Margaret O'Connell was now Margaret Harrigan, and Luke had a wife he barely knew. The small congregation offered subdued congratulations as they made their way out. Samuel Paulson shook Luke's hand firmly, while Emma Paulson pressed a small wrapped package into Maggie's hands. "For your new home," she said softly. "Every woman needs something of her own." Outside, Luke had expected they might simply collect Maggie's belongings and leave, but Samuel Paulson had other ideas. "In my office," he said in a tone that brooked no argument. "There are matters to discuss." Back in the cramped space where Luke had first negotiated with Maggie, Samuel produced a leather portfolio and a pot of ink. "Miss O'Connell, Mrs. Harrigan, asked me to draw up some papers," he explained, laying out documents on the desk. "Nothing offensive, Mr. Harrigan, just putting your agreement in writing." Luke read through the simple contract. It outlined what they'd discussed: Maggie's right to her own earnings, Luke's obligation to provide shelter and protection, mutual respect for persons and property. It was, he realized, exactly what she'd said. A partnership agreement. "This is unusual," Samuel said as Luke signed. "But then, these are unusual circumstances. Maggie's been keeping my books these past 6 months. Sharp as a tack with numbers. You're getting more than just a wife, Mr. Harrigan. I'm beginning to see that." Maggie signed with a steady hand, her new name flowing smoothly from the pen. When she finished, she looked up at Luke. "I have one more stop to make. My things are already packed at the boarding house, but I need to speak with someone." She led him to a small house on the edge of town, paint faded but garden neat. An elderly woman answered the door, her face lighting up when she saw Maggie. "Mrs. Kowalski," Maggie said, "I wanted you to meet my husband, Luke Harrigan." The woman's English was heavily accented, Polish, Luke thought, but her smile was warm. "Is good man? He treat you right?" "Yes," Maggie said simply. He's a good man." They spoke quietly for a few minutes, the older woman pressing something into Maggie's hands before they left. Walking back toward the boarding house, Luke asked, "Who was that?" "She took me in when I first came to town, fed me when I couldn't afford food, taught me to sew better than I knew." Maggie tucked whatever the woman had given her into her pocket. "I wanted her to know I was leaving properly, not running." At the boarding house, Maggie's possessions fit into 2 modest trunks and a carpet bag. Luke loaded them onto the wagon he'd rented, aware of faces watching from windows. Mrs. Pritchard stood on the porch, arms crossed. "You take care of her," she called to Luke. "She's worth 10 of most men in this town." "Yes, ma'am," Luke replied, meaning it. Maggie climbed up beside him on the wagon seat, arranging her skirts with practiced efficiency. As they rolled down Main Street, Luke noticed she sat straight-backed, eyes forward, but her hands were clenched in her lap. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "No." The word came quick and firm. I've lived in Dry Creek for 3 years when it's strange to leave. We can come back to visit. It's only a day's ride from the ranch." She turned to look at him then, really look at him. "That's kind of you to offer." They rode in silence for a while, the town falling away behind them. The road stretched ahead, rutted and uncertain, leading to a life neither of them had planned. Luke found himself stealing glances at his new wife, trying to reconcile the businesslike woman who'd negotiated their marriage with the one who'd made sure to say goodbye to an old Polish woman. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Maggie said suddenly. "A wife you didn't choose, obligations you didn't seek. Thomas put us both in a difficult position." Luke considered his words carefully. "Thomas saw something. Maybe something we don't see yet. Or maybe he was just a dying man trying to tie up loose ends. Maybe, but we're here now. We made our choices." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll be a good wife to you, Luke. I may not be what you would have chosen, but I'll work hard. I'll make your house a home. I'll stand beside you in whatever comes. I believe you will. And you?" She turned those storm cloud eyes on him. "What kind of husband will you be?" Luke thought about Thomas, about promises made in the shadow of death, about the simple gold ring now circling her finger and the weight of the vows they'd just spoken. "I'll be honest," he said finally. "I'll work hard to provide. I'll treat you with respect, and I'll try to be the man Thomas thought I was when he asked me to find you." She nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. As the wagon rolled on through the vast Montana landscape, Luke felt the strangeness of the moment, sitting beside a woman who was now his wife, heading toward a home that would now be theirs. Building a life neither had expected on the foundation of a dead man's wish. The sun climbed higher, warming the cold morning air. Beside him, Maggie pulled the package Emma Paulson had given her from her pocket. Inside was a small embroidered sampler that read, "Home is where the heart is," in careful stitches. "Sentiment," she said, but Luke noticed she held it carefully like something precious. "Nothing wrong with a little sentiment," he replied. She looked at him again, and this time he saw something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "No," she agreed. "I suppose there's not. They had a long way to go still, miles of rough road ahead. But for the first time since Thomas had pressed that handkerchief into his hand, Luke felt like maybe this journey might lead somewhere worth going. The empty storefront sat like a gap-toothed smile in Dry Creek's main street, wedged between Morrison's general store and the barber shop. Maggie stood before it, key in hand, while Luke watched from the boardwalk. 3 weeks had passed since their wedding. 3 weeks of careful politeness and learning each other's rhythms in the small ranch cabin. "You're sure about this?" Luke asked, though they'd discussed it thoroughly. "The ranch work keeps you plenty busy." Maggie turned the key, the lock protesting with rust and disuse. "Ranch work doesn't earn cash money. We need supplies for winter, and the cattle won't be ready for market until spring." She pushed open the door, releasing the musty smell of emptiness. Dust motes danced in the morning light streaming through grimy windows. The space wasn't large, maybe 15 feet wide and 20 deep, but Maggie moved through it like she could already see what it would become. "The lawyer Thompson used this for storage before he moved to Helena," she said, running her hand along a rough wooden counter. "Mrs. Morrison mentioned he left some shelving, said we could have it for the hauling." Luke had to admit her plan made sense. In the weeks since their marriage, he'd discovered his wife's talent for stretching a dollar until it screamed. She'd reorganized his haphazard pantry, mended clothes he'd thought beyond saving, and somehow made their simple meals feel like more than they were. "What do you need from me?" he asked. She looked surprised, as if she'd expected to have to fight for his support. "Help move in the heavy pieces, maybe some repairs to that back wall. I can see daylight through the boards." They spent the morning hauling shelves from the lawyer's abandoned storage room. Luke found himself impressed by Maggie's strength. She lifted her end without complaint, navigating narrow doorways with practiced ease. By noon, they'd arranged the bones of what would become her shop. "I'll need a cutting table," she said, sketching the layout in the dust on the floor. "Here, where the light's best. Shelves for fabric bolts along this wall. A corner for the sewing machine." "You have a sewing machine?" "Not yet, but Mrs. Chen is selling her old one. Says the treadle sticks, but I can fix that." Luke watched her plan, seeing the determined set of her jaw, the way she measured spaces with her steps. This wasn't just about money, he realized. This was about independence, about being more than just his wife. Over the next days, Maggie attacked the empty store with military precision. She scrubbed years of grime from the windows, swept out mouse nests and spider webs, patched holes in the walls with newspaper and flour paste. Luke came to town when he could, fixing the loose floorboards and reinforcing the sagging back wall. The transformation drew attention. Women stopped to peer through the windows, watching Maggie work. Some offered advice, others predictions of failure. Maggie acknowledged both with the same polite nod. "Don't know why she bothers." Luke overheard Mrs. Dalton say to her companion, "That Swenson woman already does mending for half the town." "Maybe so," the other woman replied, "but she charges dear for it, and her seams don't hold past a season." Maggie had obviously heard too, but she just kept painting the trim around the window, each stroke precise and even. On the 5th day, she unveiled her sign. Luke had wondered what she was working on in the evenings, bent over a piece of wood with paintbrush in hand. Now it hung above the door. M. Harrigan, tailoring and mending in neat, no-nonsense letters. "It's good work," Luke said, admiring the clean lines. "My father taught me lettering," she said quietly. Before the mine, it was the most she'd volunteered about her past since their wedding. Luke wanted to ask more, but something in her posture warned him off. The sewing machine arrived the next day, carried in the back of Wong Chen's laundry wagon. It was a Singer, older model but well-maintained despite the sticky treadle Maggie had mentioned. She and Mrs. Chen wrestled it into position while conducting rapid negotiations in a mixture of English and gestures. $15, Mrs. Chen said firmly. 12, Maggie countered. The treadle needs work and the shuttle race is worn. 14. 12, and I'll teach your daughter to do buttonholes properly. Mrs. Chen's face split into a grin. You make deal like Chinese woman. $12. Luke had quietly slipped Maggie the money that morning. Profits from pelts he'd sold the previous winter. She'd tried to refuse, reminding him of their agreement about her earnings. Starting a business requires capital, he'd said. Consider it an investment. Now, watching her carefully oil the machine's working parts, he felt oddly proud. His wife, strange how the word was beginning to fit, had vision and the courage to pursue it. The first customer came before Maggie had even officially opened. Mrs. Kowalski, the Polish woman who'd taken Maggie in, arrived with an armload of worn clothing. Is not for mending, she explained in her thick accent. Is for cutting down. My grandson in Chicago, his children need clothes, but I cannot see so good anymore for the close work. Maggie took the bundle reverently. I'll make them like new, Mrs. Kowalski. Better than new. Word spread the way it does in small towns. By the end of the first week, Maggie had a dozen orders, repairs mostly, but also 2 new shirts and a dress alteration. She worked with focused intensity, the Singer's rhythm providing a steady heartbeat to the shop. Luke found excuses to come to town more often. He told himself it was to help with the shop, but really he was fascinated by this side of his wife. At the ranch, she was quiet, efficient, careful not to intrude on what had been his space. Here, she commanded her domain with quiet authority. That seam won't hold, she told Joe Patterson, examining the torn pocket on his work pants. The fabric's too worn. I can patch it, but you'd do better to let me make you new ones. We can't afford new, Patterson grumbled. I could make them from the duck cloth Morrison's has on sale. Stronger than what you're wearing, last 3 times as long. Pay me half now for materials, half when they're done. Patterson agreed, as Maggie had probably known he would. Luke was beginning to understand her strategy. Fair prices, quality work, and payment plans that made sense for ranch hands and miners living paycheck to paycheck. Not everyone approved. Henrietta Swenson, who'd had the mending business largely to herself, made her displeasure known. That scarred creature thinks she's something special, Luke heard her say in Morrison's store, putting on airs with her painted sign and city ways. He'd turned, ready to defend his wife, but Ezra Morrison beat him to it. It seems to me a little competition's good for everyone, the shopkeeper said mildly. Keeps prices fair and work quality high. The confrontation Luke had been expecting came 2 weeks after the shop opened. He'd brought the wagon to town for supplies and stopped by to see if Maggie needed anything. He found her facing down Carl Brewster, a cowhand known more for his drinking than his sense. I paid for that shirt to be fixed proper, Brewster was saying, swaying slightly. Not to have some ugly woman's hands all over it. Maggie stood behind her counter, hands flat on its surface, expression calm. The shirt is repaired to specification. Mr. Brewster, if you're unsatisfied with the work, please show me where. Don't sass me, woman. Everyone knows you only got this shop because you trapped that fool Harrigan into marriage. Luke stepped through the door, but Maggie's slight hand motion stopped him. This was her fight. Mr. Brewster, she said, voice steady as iron. You have 2 choices. Take your shirt and leave, or I'll return your 15 cents and you can explain to the whole town why you were thrown out of my establishment for drunk and disorderly conduct. You can't throw me out, You're just a woman who pays rent on this shop, whose name is on the sign, and who has the right to refuse service to anyone who disrespects her business." She came around the counter then, all 5 feet 8 inches of controlled fury. "What's it going to be?" Brewster looked between Maggie and Luke, seemed to calculate his chances, then grabbed his shirt and stumbled out, muttering curses. Maggie returned to her work as if nothing had happened, but Luke saw the slight tremor in her hands as she picked up her needle. "You handled that well," he said. "It won't be the last time." She didn't look up from her stitching. Men like him think a scarred woman should be grateful for any attention, even insults. "If he comes back, I'll handle it." She did look up then. "I appreciate your concern, Luke, but I can't have my husband fighting my battles. It would undermine everything I'm trying to build here." Luke nodded, understanding even if his instincts rebelled against it. "At least let me walk you home in the evenings. The days are getting shorter." "That," she said with a slight smile, "I'll accept." It became their routine. Luke would finish his business in town and arrive at the shop as Maggie was closing up. They'd walk to where he'd left the wagon, talking about small things, orders she'd received, repairs needed at the ranch, plans for the coming winter. One evening, as they loaded bolts of fabric she'd bought with her first profits, Luke asked, "Are you happy?" She paused, considering. "That's a complicated question." "Is it?" "I'm satisfied," she said finally. "I have work that's mine, a roof over my head, and a husband who keeps his promises. Many women have far less." "That's not quite the same as happy." She looked at him then, really looked at him in that direct way she had. "What about you, Luke? Are you happy with a wife you didn't choose and complications you didn't want?" He thought about coming home to a warm house, meals that appeared without fail, conversation in the evening instead of silence, about watching her work with such focus and determination, building something from nothing. "I'm getting there," he said honestly. She nodded, seeming to accept this. As they drove home through the gathering dark, Luke found himself thinking that maybe happiness wasn't something you found all at once. Maybe it was something you built, piece by piece, like a shop from an empty storefront or a marriage from a dying man's wish. The trouble started on a Tuesday afternoon when the temperature had dropped low enough to make breath visible. Maggie was pinning a hem for Judge Clayton's wife when she heard the commotion outside, raised voices, the sharp crack of something breaking. Then a woman's cry. She set down her pins and moved to the window, across the street, near the entrance to Paulson's store. She could see Martha Hensley on the ground, her husband Roy standing over her with his fist raised. Blood ran from Martha's nose, bright against her pale face. Without thinking, Maggie grabbed the heavy scissors from her cutting table and strode outside. Other townspeople had noticed the disturbance but stood frozen, unwilling to interfere in what they considered a private matter between husband and wife. "Stop," Maggie called, her voice cutting through the cold air like a blade. Roy Hensley turned, his face flushed with drink and anger. "Mind your own business, woman." "Mrs. Hensley is my customer," Maggie said, moving to place herself between Roy and his wife. "I won't have her damaged before she can pick up her alterations." A nervous titter ran through the gathering crowd at her dark humor, but Maggie kept her eyes on Roy. She'd dealt with men like him before, bullies who took their failures out on anyone weaker. "Get out of my way," Roy snarled, taking a step forward. Maggie held up the scissors, the afternoon sun glinting off the steel. "Touch me or her again, Mr. Hensley, and you'll be explaining to Doc Morrison how you got a 6-inch blade in your shoulder. You wouldn't dare." "Try me." Her voice was steady as January ice. "I've faced down worse than you. At least the fire that gave me this scar had the excuse of being mindless. Roy's eyes flicked to her scarred face, then to the scissors, then to the crowd that had grown considerably. Luke had appeared at the edge of the gathering, his hand resting on his sidearm, but he made no move to intervene. He knew better now than to undermine her authority. Sheriff Coleman pushed through the crowd then, taking in the scene with weary eyes. "What's the trouble here?" "No trouble, Sheriff," Maggie said, not lowering the scissors. "Mr. Hensley was just leaving it, weren't you, Mr. Hensley?" Roy looked around, seeing no support in the faces watching him. Even the men who might normally side with a husband's rights seemed cowed by Maggie's fierce protection. "This ain't over," he muttered, but he backed away, stumbling off toward the saloon. Maggie immediately knelt beside Martha, using her own handkerchief to dab at the blood. "Can you stand?" Martha nodded, tears streaming down her bruised face. With Maggie's help, she got to her feet, leaning heavily on the taller woman's arm. "Bring her inside," Emma Paulson called from the store entrance. "I've got clean water and bandages." As Maggie helped Martha toward the store, she heard the sheriff addressing the crowd. "Show's over, folks, and move along." Inside Paulson's, Emma and Maggie worked together to clean Martha's injuries. The nose had stopped bleeding, but bruises were already forming along her jaw. "It's getting worse," Martha whispered, "ever since he lost his job at the mill." "You could leave," Emma suggested gently. "Go to your sister in Denver." "With what money?" "Everything I earn goes to keeping us fed." Martha's voice broke. "And he'd find me. He always says he'd find me." Maggie exchanged a look with Emma. They'd had this conversation with too many women over the years, always ending the same way: nowhere to go, no money to get there, and the law firmly on the husband's side. "You can work for me," Maggie said suddenly. "I need help with the simple mending and can't pay much, but you could save a little." Martha's eyes widened. He'd never allow it. "Then don't tell him." Maggie's tone was matter-of-fact. "Come in while he's at work or passed out drunk. I'll pay you in cash. Keep no records." That's very kind, but..." "It's not kindness, it's business. I have more work than I can handle alone." Maggie stood, smoothing her skirts. "Think about it. My door's open when you decide." She left Martha in Emma's capable hands and returned to her shop, where a small crowd had gathered. Word of the confrontation had spread, and opinions were flowing freely. "About time someone stood up to Roy Hensley," one woman said. "Disgraceful, threatening a man with scissors," countered another. "What kind of example is that?" Maggie ignored them all, returning to Judge Clayton's wife's hem as if nothing had happened. But her hands shook slightly as she worked, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Luke appeared in the doorway as the crowd dispersed. That was brave, also possibly foolish. Someone had to do something. The sheriff would have told Roy to sleep it off and Martha to be a better wife. Maggie's voice was bitter. "I've seen it too many times." Luke was quiet for a moment. "He might come after you. Men like that don't forget being humiliated." "Let him try." She met his eyes. "I meant what I said, but I've faced worse." That evening, as they ate dinner at the ranch, Luke watched his wife across the table. In the months since their marriage, he'd learned her moods, the slight furrow between her brows when she was calculating figures, the way she hummed tunelessly while cooking, how she rubbed her scarred temple when tired. But today had shown him something new, the fierce protector beneath the practical exterior. "Tell me about the fire," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. They'd developed an unspoken agreement about the past, his or hers, leaving it undisturbed like a closed grave. "Why now?" "Because today I saw you face down a man twice your size without flinching. That kind of courage doesn't come from nowhere." Maggie set down her fork, fingers tracing the wood grain of the table. I told you I was 10. You told me the what, not the why. She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, my mother took in piecework from the textile factory. Paid by the piece, barely enough to keep us fed after father died. She worked 18-hour days, eyes going bad from the close work, fingers bleeding from the needle pricks. Luke waited, letting the story come at its own pace. The factory owner, Mr. Garrett, would come by sometimes and check on the work. He said, but he'd stay too long, stand too close. Mother would send me outside, but I knew. Children always know. The lamp flame flickered, casting shadows across her scarred face. One night he came by drunk. Mother tried to make him leave, but he wouldn't go. I heard her scream. Maggie's voice had gone flat, reporting facts like items in a ledger. I grabbed the oil lamp and threw it at him. His clothes caught fire. So did the curtains, the piecework, everything. Mother got me out, but I went back for that sewing box. Stupid child, thinking we needed that thimble more than we needed our lives. What happened to Garrett? He burned, but survived. Told everyone Mother had attacked him, that the fire was her fault. Who would believe a seamstress and a scarred child over a respectable businessman? She touched her face unconsciously. We left town after that. Mother never said, but I knew she blamed me. Not for the fire, for not letting it happen quietly. Luke reached across the table, covering her hand with his. She didn't pull away, but she didn't respond either. She was wrong, he said. Was she? We lost everything. I carry the mark of my interference every day. She turned her hand palm up under his, studying the contrast, his calloused and sun-dark, hers pale despite the work. But I'd do it again. That's what Mother never understood. Some things are worth the scars they leave. Like today. Like today. She pulled her hand back gently. Roy Hensley will make trouble. Men like him always do when women don't know their place. And then he'll find trouble waiting for him. Maggie looked at him sharply. I know you don't need protection, but you have it anyway. That's what marriage means, doesn't it? Standing together. She considered this. Thomas told me you were a good man. I'm beginning to see what he meant. It was the closest thing to affection she'd expressed since their wedding. Luke felt warmth spread through his chest, unexpected and welcome. Over the following days, the incident with Roy Hensley rippled through Dry Creek like a stone in still water. Some women began greeting Maggie with newfound respect. Others whispered behind their hands about unseemly behavior and dangerous precedents. Martha Hensley appeared at the shop 3 days later, sporting a black eye but carrying a basket of mending. If the offer still stands, she said quietly. It does. Can you do buttonholes? Yes, ma'am. Good. Mrs. Patterson needs 12 shirts finished by week's end. The buttonholes are all that's left. Maggie showed her to a chair by the window where the light was best. Pay is 10 cents per shirt. 15 if the buttonholes are exceptional. Martha's eyes widened. It was more than fair, generous even. Thank you. Don't thank me, just do good work. As Martha settled in with needle and thread, Maggie caught sight of movement outside. Roy Hensley stood across the street, watching the shop with dark eyes. She met his gaze steadily through the window until he spat in the dirt and moved on. He'll cause trouble, Martha said softly. Probably. Maggie returned to her cutting table. But that's tomorrow's worry. Today, we have buttonholes to finish. The shop filled with the quiet rhythm of needles through cloth. 2 women working side by side, building something stronger than fear. Outside, clouds gathered on the horizon, promising snow before nightfall. But inside Maggie's small domain, the light was warm and steady, holding back the darkness for a little while longer. The idea came to Maggie on a cold March morning as she watched Luke struggle with the ranch ledgers. He was a capable man with livestock and land, but numbers on a page seemed to fight him at every turn. "The Henderson place has good bottomland," she said, setting down his coffee. 40 acres along the creek." Luke looked up from his figures. "Old man Henderson's been trying to sell for 2 years. Wants too much for it. He wants $300, but he also needs 2 suits for his son's weddings and new curtains for his wife. I could trade work for part of the price." "We don't have $300, not with the cattle prices what they are." Maggie sat across from him, pulling the ledger closer. "We have 140 from the pelts. I've saved 60 from the shop. If Henderson takes 50 in trade work, that leaves 50 to figure. Where do we get $50? "We sell the 2 steers you were planning to keep for breeding. Buy better stock next year when the flax crop comes in." Luke stared at her. Flax crop. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, the proposal she'd been turning over in her mind for weeks. "That bottomland is perfect for flax. Steady water, good drainage, protected from the worst winds. We plant 20 acres this spring, harvest in July. I can process the fiber, spin thread, weave cloth. There's not a decent fabric supplier within 100 miles of Dry Creek." "Hey, Maggie, I'm a cattleman, not a farmer." "You're a businessman," she corrected. "Or you should be. Cattle prices fluctuate with the market. Disease can wipe out a herd, but people always need clothing. Always." She spread out papers she'd been working on, calculations of seed costs, yield estimates, projected profits. Luke studied them, brow furrowed. "You've put thought into this." "I've put 3 months of evenings into this." She leaned forward, intensity brightening her gray eyes. "Luke, we could build something real here, not just scraping by year to year, but actually building. The ranch produces the raw material. My shop processes and sells it. We control the whole chain. It's a risk. If the crop fails, then we're out seed money and labor. But if it succeeds, we could clear enough to buy more land, better equipment, maybe even hire help for the busy seasons." Luke was quiet, studying first the papers, then his wife. The lamplight caught the silver threads in her dark hair. She'd aged in the months since their marriage. But it suited her somehow. Made her look less like a woman trying to disappear and more like one ready to be seen. "You really think this could work?" "I know it can. My mother's family were weavers in Ireland. I learned at my grandmother's knee before." She touched her scar absently. "Before. It's good land. Luke. And we're good together." The last words hung between them, carrying more weight than talk of crops and profits. They'd found a rhythm these past months, a partnership that worked better than either had expected. But this would be different, not just sharing a house and a name, but building a future together. "All right," Luke said finally. "We'll make Henderson an offer." Maggie's smile transformed her face, pulling the scarred side up in a way that should have been grotesque but somehow wasn't. "You won't regret this." "I'm already regretting it," he said, but he was smiling too. The negotiation with Henderson took place in Paulson's store, with Samuel acting as witness. The old rancher was skeptical at first. A woman doing business still sat poorly with many men, but Maggie's combination of logic and determination wore him down. 2 suits, curtains for 3 rooms, and $150 cash. Henderson said finally. "Paid in full by harvest time. 2 suits, curtains, $50 cash now, and $100 at harvest." Maggie countered. "Plus first option to buy your wool clip for the next 3 years at fair market price." Henderson's eyes sharpened. He'd been struggling to find buyers for his sheep's wool. "You spin wool too?" I will. Give me good fleece and I'll give you thread that'll make your wife forget she ever wanted store-bought. They shook on it, Maggie's handshake as firm as any man's. Luke signed the papers. The land had to be in his name, the law being what it was. But everyone in the room knew who'd driven the bargain. Word of the purchase spread quickly. Some called Luke foolish for letting his wife talk him into farming. Others wondered what a scarred seamstress knew about growing flax. But Samuel Paulson placed an advance order for 20 bolts of linen, and Emma Paulson began talking about curtains for the store. The real work began in April. Luke broke the ground with a borrowed plow while Maggie followed behind, removing rocks and roots. It was back-breaking labor, made harder by spring rains that turned the soil to mud. But Maggie never complained, never suggested they'd made a mistake, even when her hands blistered and her back ached so badly she could barely stand straight. I could hire help, Luke offered one evening, watching her soak her swollen hands in salt water. With what money? We need every cent for seed and equipment. She flexed her fingers, wincing. Besides, I need to know this land, every rock, every slope. Can't do that from the kitchen. They planted on a clear May morning, working in companionable silence. Luke made the furrows while Maggie followed with the seed bag, placing each handful with deliberate care. By nightfall, 20 acres lay seeded and ready, waiting for sun and rain to work their magic. The first shoots appeared 2 weeks later, bright green against the dark soil. Maggie knelt between the rows, running her fingers over the delicate plants with something approaching reverence. My grandmother would have loved this, she said softly. She always talked about the flax fields in County Down, blue as the sea when they bloomed. It was the most she'd ever volunteered about her family before the fire. Luke knelt beside her, studying her profile in the morning light. Tell me about her. She was formidable, raised 8 children after my grandfather died, kept the weaving business going through the famine, came to America with nothing but her loom and her pride. Maggie smiled at the memory. She taught me that hands were meant for working, not wringing, that a woman's worth wasn't in her face but in what she could produce. Wise woman. She was, I wish. Maggie stopped, shaking her head. No use wishing for the dead to see what we've built. Maybe she does see. Maggie looked at him then, really looked at him in that direct way of hers. You're not what I expected. Luke Harrigan? What did you expect? A man who'd made a promise he regretted, who'd do his duty but no more. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. Instead, I got a partner. Through the spring and into summer, they tended the flax like anxious parents. Maggie walked the fields morning and evening, checking for pests, monitoring growth, pulling weeds with obsessive care. Luke had never seen her so alive, so present in her own skin. The shop suffered some from her divided attention, but Martha Hensley had proven a capable assistant. She'd left Roy after he'd come home drunk once too often, taking shelter with the Kowalskis while she saved money for the journey to her sister. Her presence freed Maggie to focus on the crop that would make or break their future. In town, opinions remained divided. Henrietta Swenson predicted failure daily, while Emma Paulson quietly commissioned a full set of household linens. Judge Clayton's wife placed an order for tablecloths, and even Mrs. Mount Morrison allowed that homegrown fabric might be acceptable for everyday use. They're waiting to see if we fail, Maggie said one evening as they watched the flax fields ripple in the wind. The plants were tall now, almost ready for harvest, their blue flowers fading to seed. Let them wait. Luke put his arm around her shoulders, felt her lean into him slightly. It was still new, this casual intimacy, but it felt right. We know what we've built. Hey, Dewey? She turned to face him, searching his face. Luke, what are we building? Really? He thought about it, looking out over the fields they'd planted together. The ranch that was becoming theirs instead of just his. The future that stretched before them bright with possibility. A life, he said simply, one the kind neither of us expected but both of us needed. She nodded, satisfied with the answer. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they stood together watching their flax fields catch the light. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of harvest, the endless labor of processing fiber into thread into cloth. But tonight, they had this moment of quiet accomplishment, this proof that two damaged people could build something whole. Your Thomas was a romantic fool, Maggie said suddenly. But he was right about one thing. What's that? We are stronger together than apart. Luke pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. In the distance, a nighthawk called, and the first stars began to appear. The flax rustled in the evening breeze, ready for harvest, ready to become something more than just plants in a field. Just like them, Luke thought, ready to become something more than just two people keeping a promise to a dead man. The first snow of December fell thick and silent, muffling the sounds of Dry Creek under a white blanket. Luke had come to town for supplies, but something in Sheriff Coleman's expression when he passed made him turn toward Main Street instead of heading straight home. He found a crowd gathered outside the saloon, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Through the muttering voices, he caught Maggie's name and quickened his pace. What's happened? He asked Ezra Morrison. The shopkeeper's face was grim. Roy Hensley's back, drunk as a lord and making threats about your wife. Says she cost him his woman and his reputation. Luke's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, but Morrison caught his arm. She's in her shop. Safe for now. But Hensley's working himself up to something. Through the saloon's grimy window, Luke could see Roy holding court at the bar, gesturing wildly as he spoke. Even from outside, his slurred words carried, "Ain't scarred witch thinks she's better'n everyone. Turn my wife against me, God gonna teach her what happens when women forget their place." Luke turned away, jaw tight. His first instinct was to go in there, to end this before it started. But Maggie had been clear. She needed to fight her own battles, needed the town to see her as capable, not as a woman hiding behind her husband's gun. He made his way to her shop, finding her at the cutting table working on a length of their own linen. The harvest had been good, the processing successful, and orders were coming in faster than she could fill them. She looked up when he entered, reading his face immediately. Roy's back, she said, and it wasn't a question. Drunk and making threats, you should close early. Come home with me now. She set down her scissors carefully. If I run every time a man makes threats, I'll never stop running. Maggie. No, Luke, this is my work, my place. I won't let him take that from me. They were still arguing when the door burst open. Roy Hensley stood swaying in the doorway, eyes bloodshot, coat dusted with snow. The smell of whiskey rolled off him in waves. Well, well, the happy couple. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him. Come to see what you stole from me. You need to leave, Roy. Maggie's voice was steady, but Luke saw her hand inch toward the scissors. Leave, Roy laughed, an ugly sound. Like my wife left, filling her head with ideas, turning her against her lawful husband. You ruined my life. You ruined your own life, Maggie said quietly. Martha just finally found the courage to save hers. Roy's face darkened. He lunged forward faster than a drunk man should be able to move. But Luke was faster. He stepped between them, catching Roy's wrist as he swung. Don't, Luke said, voice low and dangerous. Roy tried to pull free, cursing. Get out of my way, this is between me and that. You touch my wife. You deal with me. Luke's grip tightened. And unlike her, I don't believe in giving warnings. For a moment, they stood frozen, Roy's alcohol-soaked brain trying to process the threat. Then he jerked away, stumbling backward. "This ain't over," he snarled. "You can't watch her every minute." He slammed out, leaving them in ringing silence. Luke turned to find Maggie standing rigid, hands clenched at her sides. "I had it handled," she said. "I know." He moved closer, not touching but near enough that she could feel his presence. "But you don't have to handle everything alone. That's what I've been trying to tell you." She looked up at him, and he saw something shift in her storm-gray eyes. "I've been alone so long. I don't know how to be any other way." "Then learn." He did touch her then, just a hand on her shoulder. "We're partners, remember? In the flax fields, in the business, in this life we're building. Partners stand together." She covered his hand with hers, the first time she'd initiated such contact. "He won't let this go." "I know, but we'll face whatever comes, and together." That evening, Luke walked Maggie home as usual, but he kept his hand on his gun and his eyes on the shadows. The snow continued to fall, erasing tracks almost as soon as they were made. At the shop door, Maggie paused. "Thank you," she said simply, "for understanding when to step in and when to stand back. Not many men would." "You're not many women." She smiled then, that rare full smile that transformed her face. "Thomas told me you were different." I'm beginning to understand what he meant. They made it to the wagon without incident, but Luke couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the darkness. As they drove home through the swirling snow, Maggie sat closer to him than usual, their shoulders touching. "I've been thinking," she said as the ranch came into view, "about what you said, about not handling everything alone, and maybe it's time I stopped seeing our marriage as just a business arrangement." Luke's heart skipped, but he kept his voice steady. "What would you see it as instead?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "A partnership, a true one, in all things." He pulled the wagon up to the barn, turned to face her in the lamplight spilling from the house. "Maggie, are you saying—" "I'm saying I care for you, Luke Harrigan, more than I expected to, more than I wanted to." She touched his face, her fingers cold against his cheek. "I'm saying that somewhere between planting flax and fighting off drunk bullies, I fell in love with my husband." Luke caught her hand, pressed it against his cheek. "Maggie, She kissed him then, cutting off whatever he'd been about to say. It wasn't their first kiss. They'd had the chaste peck at their wedding, but it was the first that meant something. The first born of choice rather than obligation. When they pulled apart, both breathing unsteadily, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too. Have for months. I think. Just didn't know how to say it. We're quite a pair," she murmured. "A woman who can't accept help and a man who doesn't know how to offer it. We're learning." They went inside together, and for the first time since their wedding, they truly shared the house as husband and wife. Later, lying together in the darkness with snow tapping against the windows, Maggie traced patterns on Luke's chest. "Roy will come back," she said. "Probably." "I'm not afraid." "I know." He pulled her closer. "But you don't have to be brave alone anymore." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That might be the best gift anyone's ever given me. The permission to not be strong all the time." "You gave me something too," Luke said. "A reason to be strong for something besides myself. Outside, The storm intensified, wind howling around the corners of the house. But inside, they were warm and safe. Two people who'd found each other through tragedy and built something beautiful from the ashes of other lives. "Do you think Thomas knew?" Maggie asked sleepily. "When he sent you to find me. Do you think he knew it would become this?" Luke thought about his old friend, dying in that cold cabin, pressing a stranger's handkerchief into his hand. Maybe. He always was a romantic under all that rough talk. "I'm glad," she murmured against his chest. "Glad he was romantic enough to believe we belonged together. So am I." They slept then, wrapped around each other while the storm raged outside. In the morning there would be chores and challenges, Roy Hensley's threats and the town's gossip. But tonight they had this: the warmth of new love, the comfort of partnership, the promise of a future neither had dared imagine when a dying man's wish first brought them together. In the barn, Luke's horse nickered softly, settling for the night. In the kitchen, the stove ticked as it cooled. And in the bedroom, two people who'd thought themselves too damaged for love discovered that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected promises. The snow continued to fall, covering the flax fields, the roads, the whole world in a blanket of white. By morning, their tracks from town would be gone, erased as if they'd never been. But what they'd built together, the love, the trust, the partnership, that would endure long after the snow melted and spring came again to Montana territory. Spring arrived early that year, melting the mountain snow and filling the creeks to bursting. Luke stood at the edge of their expanded flax fields, 40 acres now. The success of last year's crop allowing them to buy the adjoining plot from a departing homesteader. The green shoots pushed through the dark soil like promises kept. "We'll need to hire help for the harvest," Maggie said, coming to stand beside him. She carried a ledger, as always these days, their business having grown beyond what she could keep in her head. "I've had inquiries from 3 families looking for work. The Kowalski boys? Among others, good workers, and their mother vouches for them." She made a note. "I thought we could offer room and board plus wages. Convert the old tack room into quarters." Luke nodded, marveling as always at how naturally she'd taken to managing not just a household but a growing enterprise. Her shop in town now employed 2 other women full-time, and their linen had begun appearing in stores as far away as Great Falls. "There's something else," Maggie said, closing the ledger. Martha Hensley wrote. "She's settled in Denver, working at a dress shop. She wanted us to know she's well." "Any word of Roy?" "Nothing for months. Some say he headed south to the mining camps. Others that he drank himself to death in some nameless town." She touched Luke's arm. "Either way, he's gone." They walked back toward the house together, past the vegetable garden Maggie had insisted on planting, past the new chicken coop, past all the small improvements that had transformed his bachelor's ranch into their thriving homestead. "I've been thinking," Luke said as they reached the porch, "about that section across the creek. Henderson's son wants to sell." Maggie's eyes lit up. "The one with the southern exposure? That would be perfect for expanding the flax operation. Or," Luke said carefully, "for building a proper house. This cabin's getting a bit small, don't you think?" She looked at him sharply, reading something in his expression. "Luke Harrigan, what aren't you telling me?" He took her hand, led her to the porch swing they'd installed last summer. "Doc Morrison stopped by the shop yesterday while you were at the Paulsons. Said you'd been to see him." Color rose in her cheeks. "That man can't keep a secret to save his life." "Maggie," his voice was gentle. "Is it true? Are we having a baby?" "Yes." She met his eyes, vulnerability replacing her usual composure. I wanted to be sure before I told you. I know we never discuss children. If you're not pleased—" He silenced her with a kiss, pouring all his joy and wonder into the contact. When they parted, both were breathless. "Not pleased, Maggie. I've been hoping for this since the night of the blizzard, since you told me you loved me." "Truly?" "Truly." He placed his hand over her still flat stomach. "A child. Our child. Be due in autumn. Doc Morrison thinks after the harvest." She covered his hand with hers. "I can still work until—" "You'll do what feels right," Luke interrupted. "We have help now. The business can survive if you need to rest." She laughed, the sound bright in the spring air. "Can you imagine me resting? I'll be sorting flax with one hand and holding a baby with the other." That evening, they sat by the fire planning. The new house would have 4 bedrooms, room to grow, Maggie said with a shy smile, a proper kitchen, and a workspace where she could process flax without having to use the barn. And a real parlor, she added, with windows facing east to catch the morning light. "Whatever you want." Luke pulled her close, still marveling at how natural this had become. "We can afford it now, thanks to your business sense." "Our business sense," she corrected. "I may have had the ideas, but you made them possible. The way you've managed the planting, the irrigation system you designed, none of this works without both of us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire die to embers. Then Maggie stirred, reaching for something on the side table. "I almost forgot. This came in the mail yesterday." She handed him an envelope, his name written in unfamiliar script. Luke opened it, finding a single sheet covered in careful writing. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to amazement. "What is it?" Maggie asked. "It's from Thomas's sister in St. Louis. He told her about us in his last letter. Asked her to send this if—" He cleared his throat, emotion thickening his voice. "If we made a go of it." He handed her the letter. Thomas's sister wrote of her brother's certainty that Luke and Maggie belonged together, how he'd spoken of them both with such affection. At the bottom, she'd added a postscript. "He left something for you. I'm sending it separately." 3 days later, a package arrived. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a small wooden box. Luke recognized it immediately. Thomas had carved it during their first winter trapping together, working by firelight to pass the long evenings. Inside the box lay 2 items, a gold pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas's father, and a sealed letter. Luke's hands shook slightly as he opened it. "My friend," he read aloud. "If you're reading this, then you kept your promise and found my Maggie. More than that, Mary's letter means you've made a life together. I knew you would. You were always too stubborn to fail at anything that mattered, and she's too strong to let you. I'm not much for fancy words, but I want you to know. Sending you to her wasn't just about keeping a promise. It was about giving the 2 best people I knew a chance at happiness. You saved my life once. Luke, let me return the favor by saving yours from loneliness and hers from hardship. Be good to each other. Build something lasting. And when your children ask how you met, tell them a foolish romantic played matchmaker from beyond the grave. Your friend always, Thomas Hale. P.S. The watch was my father's. Meant to give it to my son someday and give it to yours instead." Maggie wiped tears from her cheeks, not seeming to care that they fell on both the scarred and unscarred sides. He knew. Somehow he knew what we could be together. Luke pulled out the handkerchief that had started it all, the one with the embroidered M that he'd carried for months before finally returning it to Maggie. She kept it in her sewing box now, carefully pressed between layers of tissue. "Should we frame the letter?" Maggie asked. "Display it in the new house?" "No," Luke said after a moment's thought. Let's keep it here. He placed it back in the carved box with the watch. Someday, when our children are old enough, we'll show them. Tell them the whole story. The whole story? Maggie smiled. Even the part where I threatened to stab Roy Hensley with scissors? Especially that part. They should know their mother's courage and their father's honor. The man who kept an impossible promise and found love in the bargain. That night, as they lay together listening to spring rain on the roof, Luke felt Thomas's presence like a blessing. His friend was gone, but his legacy lived on in the life they'd built, the child they'd created, the love that had grown from such an unlikely beginning. I want to name him Thomas, Maggie said into the darkness. If it's a boy, and if it's a girl, I hope, she said after a moment. Because that's what this is, isn't it? Hope made real? Luke kissed her forehead, her temple, the ridge of scar tissue that had once defined her but now seemed like just another part of the woman he loved. Outside, the rain continued, soaking into the earth, nurturing the flax that would soon bloom blue as a Montana sky. Inside, two people who'd found each other through loss and promise settled into sleep. The carved box on the mantel holding memories of the friend who'd known their hearts before they did. In the morning, there would be fields to tend and fabric to weave, a business to run and a house to plan. But tonight, they had this. The quiet certainty of love, the promise of new life, and the knowledge that some friendships transcend even death to create something beautiful. The handkerchief with its embroidered M lay safe in Maggie's sewing box. No longer a token of absence, but a reminder of presence, of Thomas, who'd seen what they could be, and of themselves, who'd had the courage to become it. Snow would come again to Montana territory, and sun, and rain, and all the seasons of a life. But Luke and Maggie Harrigan would face them together, building their future on the foundation of a promise kept and a love unexpected but absolutely right.